Should I start?
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I, Khurshid Kotwal, a fellow chartered accountant from the Institute of Chartered Accountant for the past 30 years, would like to welcome you all for this webinar on Pakistan's economy and views on the forthcoming federal budget 21-22, which is likely to be announced on June 11th, 2021. This webinar is organized by the Economic Affairs and Government Relations Committee of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Pakistan. We will now start with a recitation from the Holy Quran. Can we please have the recording?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان والأرض وضعها للأنام فيها فاكهة والنخل ذات الأكمام والحب ذو العصف والريحان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان خلق الإنسان من صلصال كالفخار وخلق الجان من مارج من نار فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان رب المشرقين ورب المغربين فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان صدق الله خالقنا المولانا العلي العظيم.
A budget is the financial plan of the country with the objective to promote the growth of the economy, reduce unemployment, poverty, inequalities, and ensure proper utilization of funds. Today, we will hear from our eminent speakers about the V-shaped recovery of the Pakistan economy and the views on the surprising 3.94 growth in GDP for the fiscal year 2020-21 versus a much lower target of 3% projected by the State Bank and Ministry of Finance. I'm sure everyone today is looking forward to this session on the 2021 budget, as I remember when I was at Unilever and as the corporate finance director, we were very much glued to these sessions, the TV and news, to understand the implications on our businesses. Let us also hear some thoughts from our distinguished speakers on some of the next year out of the box budget and targets. That is an economic growth of 5.2%, an inflation of 8%, and an ambitious 5.8 trillion tax collection target. Pakistan's tax GDP ratio is only 11%. And to have a fiscal independence, the ratio needs to be in the range of 20 to 21%. So let's hear some views on how the government plans to raise this by 1% every year. We now have with us Mr. Iftikhar Taj to make the opening remarks. Mr. Iftikhar is currently the president of the Institute of the Chartered Accountants and has also been the vice president and a council member since 2017. In his quiet and self-effacing manner, Mr. Iftikhar has played a pivotal role in the numerous committees of ICAP, like the Investigation Committee, Marketing Committee, IT Committee, Committee on Fiscal Laws, Education and Training, Building Committee, PAIB Committee, and Practicing Members Committee, and also on the Digital Assurance and Auditing Board. Mr. Iftikhar Taj is a governance expert with over 30 years of industry experience in financial services, fast-moving consumer goods, company, information technology, textile, media, advertising, and bulk drug manufacturing sectors in various roles. He's also a technical advisor on the PAIB Committee of International Federation of Accountants, New York, USA. Currently, he is working as a director governance and strategy at Crow Hussain Chaudhary and Co. Over to you, Mr. Iftikhar.
Thank you. Thank you, Khurshid. But it's very lengthy introduction. थोड़ा छोटा होना चाहिए था. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Dr. साहब सबसे पहले तो आपको वेलकम करता हूँ to the ICAP platform, and it's a really pleasure and honor for us to have you here, and I will be very keen to listen to you. I know your views are always very vocal and loud, and that's what I love about you.
Thank you.
I welcome all the members of Institute and all other professionals who have joined us in this webinar. I congratulate Ashfaq Tola Sahab for organizing this seminar. This is very, very important seminar, and the timing is right. And at the same time, I also welcome Sana Qadri and Ali Latif, our Vice President.
Thank you, sir.
Budget is always very, very important. There used to be a time जब इसको शायद वाकई बजट कहते थे. मैं 2000 से पहले की बातें कर रहा हूँ, जब 90s 80s उस जमाने में शायद बाकी बजट होता था, क्योंकि ये पूरे साल के लिए बजट होता था. अब तो हर रोज एक नया बजट है, हर 15 दिन के बाद एक नया बजट है. बट स्टिल एक मेजर जो डिसीजन मेकिंग है वो सामने नजर आती है, प्लान्स नजर आते हैं गवर्नमेंट के. इन पर्टिकुलर हमें देखने की जरूरत है इस बजट को. We cannot see the budget in isolation. Budget cannot be prepared by the government in isolation. सारी चीजें साथ साथ हैं. FATF भी हमारे पास है, फलस्तीन की सिचुएशन भी है, अफगानिस्तान की सिचुएशन भी है, इजराइल की रिकग्निशन का मैटर भी है, अरब कंट्रीज भी हैं, और इन तमाम सिनेरियोज के साथ एक बजट एक्सरसाइज है जो गवर्नमेंट ने करनी होती है. और आज की गवर्नमेंट के पास भी इसी तरह की सिनेरियोज हैं, और 2 साल बाद इलेक्शन भी होपफुली ड्यू है. तो इन तमाम सिनेरियोज के साथ एक बजट क्या होता है, और डॉक्टर साहब अगर रोशनी डाल सकें. हम अक्सर सुनते हैं कि ये परसेंटेज नंबर फेज है. हमेशा हम कभी भी ये नहीं सुनते किसी से कि नंबर जो है रिलायबल है. मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ स्टैटिस्टिक्स शायद नंबर देती है, कभी प्लानिंग का वो रेफरेंस दिया जाता है, कभी स्टेट बैंक का रेफरेंस दिया जाता है, कभी हमें बताया जाता है कि जो इंटरनेशनल बॉडीज हैं वो तो नंबर एक्सेप्ट कर रही हैं. So there is always a doubt on the numbers. Though I trust my government numbers, whichever be the government, because that is the only source which is authentic in front of us. With that note, Dr. Saab, I welcome you once again. And thank you, Urshid, for providing me the opportunity to welcome everyone. Thank you very much.
Urshid, you are mute, I think.
Abdullah sir, I think she's experienced some difficulties. So
Okay, okay, okay.
आप अगर खुद ही continue कर
Okay,
लें तो
मैं
it will be
कर
great.
लेता हूँ. Now the next thing is, to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Hafeez Pasha Saab. Pasha Saab is a name to reckon with, and he is a living legend in Pakistan. He is an economist, I think, who is giving a correct picture. And I think Pasha Saab का introduction मुझे कराना मेरे लिए फखर की बात है, since he is the guy जो मेरे mentor भी हैं, और I am privileged कि एक दो assignments में मैंने इनसे बहुत सीखा, और एक तो ऐसी कमाल की चीज सिखाई उन्होंने, मैं जब हम SRB के उस पे काम कर रहे थे, तो how to size the economy of a province, which was otherwise very difficult for me to understand, but with his expertise I learned a lot, and that's why I have some competence and some spark in economic affairs of the country. Pasha Saab, mashallah, is chairman of advisory panel of economists in the Planning Commission, and then he was convener of Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister of Pakistan. He was chairman of Tax Advisory Council of Federal Board of Revenue, जिसका मैं भी एक छोटा सा member था, and we learned a lot from his taxation acumen. Then a pride of him is that he was Assistant Secretary General of United Nations. तो वो जो कारनामा था, मेरा ख्याल है वो तो पाकिस्तानी कोई और अचीव कर ही नहीं सका. Then माशाल्लाह जी lifetime achievement award उन्होंने हासिल किया. Then he was awarded as a Congressional Medal of Achievement in Philippine Congress in 2005. Again, Dean of School of Liberal Art and Social Sciences of Beacon House, National University Lahore, and Vice Chairman of Institute of Public Policy. Pasha Saab was advisor finance government of Pakistan, और इनकी मौजूदगी में पाकिस्तान ने काफी नी जर्क रिकवरीज की, और उन मुश्किल हालात में बनते थे जब मेरा ख्याल है जब पाकिस्तान ने न्यूक्लियर टेस्ट किया, और आज मेरा ख्याल है उसका एक बहुत बड़ा दिन भी है. और इसी दिन के हिसाब से मैं पाशा साहब को मुबारकबाद देता हूं कि आपने उस वक्त जब हमारा डॉलर बड़ा बम्पी राइड करता था, एंड यू आर द ओनली वन जिसने काफी इसको सेटल किया. तो पाशा साहब इज बेसिकली MA फ्रॉम कैम्ब्रिज यूनिवर्सिटी UK, and he is PhD from Stanford University. He is author of more than 150 books, mashallah, in the field of governance, public finance, urban and regional economies, poverty and social development, industry and energy economy. So please welcome Pasha Saab. Pasha Saab will brief us on the economy of Pakistan and the present status and likely future of economy of Pakistan. Pasha Saab, over to you.
Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Iftikhar Raj Saab, Madam Khurshid, Ashfaq Tola, and the other distinguished members of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Pakistan. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to be present here at a time when Pakistan is, as was said a few minutes ago, hopefully on the right side of the V-shaped curve. And how can we proceed from here? And inshallah, can Pakistan stage a comeback once again? These are some of the fundamental issues which are, of course, constantly being discussed today in the media and elsewhere. And I'll try and make my own small, humble contribution to analysis of the trends and what are the prospects for Pakistan. Let me start by first saying that the government estimates of the GDP growth rate, which were released recently, are that in the year 2019-20, the growth rate, they have revised from -0.4% to marginally to -0.5%. As far as this year's growth rate is concerned, based on data only for 6 to 9 months of the year, since the year hasn't come to an end, this is the first provisional estimate. The growth rate has been reported at plus 3.94%. It turns out that given these two growth rates, the V curve does not appear to be as pronounced as we all think it probably was. You see, when you look at what happened after the first COVID attack towards the end of February 2020, the next 4 months, we saw a very, very difficult situation emerging with all the lockdowns and the closures and so on, with service activities being suspended, educational institutions being closed. The end result was that industrial production over these period up to June 2020 declined by 25% in relation to the previous year's level. Exports fell by 33%. Electricity generation down by 12%, and so on. And yet, for some reason, Pakistan Bureau of Statistics claims, even on the basis of the full 12-month data now for 2019-20, that the dip in the growth rate was only minus 0.5%. I and two of my PhD students, we have spent the last few days working on this national income accounts. You know, I would like to say that we have gone through the numbers fairly diligently and carefully. And let me tell you that our estimate is that last year, because of this very big drop which took place in the economy after the end of February, the economy was actually down and shrank by 2.1%. That gives you a true V-shaped curve. Minus 2.1 last year, we have no problem with the estimate of 4% this year. But this we have accepted because we believe that the base is lower and therefore a growth rate of 4% is feasible and has probably been achieved in the first 9 months. It could well be higher if the third attack does not prove to be as intensive as the first one, although the indications are initially that it is, in fact, the peak has been higher now in the third attack than in the first attack. So, however, the 4% looks all right. So, in summary, the GDP growth rate, we believe, is minus 2.1%, and last year and 4% this year, cumulatively a growth of just under 2%. Whereas if you take the government numbers, the cumulative growth over the 2-year period is 3.5%, which is significantly higher. Let me highlight to you what I see are the principal dimensions of the state of the economy today, and based on that, what we see as some of the prospects, and then I will, of course, focus on the budget parameters and what are some of the key budgetary issues. The first point to note is that there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that the economy is beginning to emerge out of this recession, which was caused particularly in 2018-19, even prior to COVID-19, by the intense IMF program conditionalities which we had to implement. And the economy is, I think, beginning to stage a comeback. And inshallah, we look forward to better prospects for next year. However, the problem is this trade-off between growth and inflation. What we are beginning to see today in Pakistan is persistence of a relatively high rate of inflation since 2019. It has been averaging anywhere between 10 to 11%, and currently the rate is, for the month of April, was almost just over 11%. And you know, the worst and most tragic part of this inflation is the fact that food inflation is going up by almost 16%. Now, our estimates are that after the first attack, almost 5 million people lost their jobs. Although the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, in its survey, post-COVID survey of 6,000 households, had revealed that 23 million workers had been affected, either in terms of lower incomes or even layoffs. I think at this point in time, the increase in the number unemployed was about 5 million, and they are slowly being reabsorbed. Currently, we estimate about 3 million or more still remain unemployed, and the poverty level has gone up significantly. Something like 3 million more families have been added to those living below the poverty line. Now, the good news first. The good news is the remarkable success Pakistan has achieved on the balance of payments, particularly on the current account front. Allah ke fazl se, we actually, for the first time in many, many years, are carrying a small surplus. And only 3 years ago, if you remember, we had a record deficit of $20 billion. There are two fundamental reasons why this has happened. Perhaps the one which has been most frequently pointed out and highlighted undoubtedly with due appreciation is the phenomenal 30% growth in home remittance. And this has come at a very unexpected time. The World Bank had projected earlier that globally remittances would fall by over $100 billion. Instead, they've gone up in Pakistan's case by at least $7 to $8 billion. And this has provided enormous support to the current account. The other reason, of course, is the fact that compared to the level of imports in 2017-18, our imports are down by about $8 to $10 billion. Unfortunately, the story is not one of export-led growth. Exports are now showing some growth, but primarily because of the low base in the last 4 months of 2019-20. However, let me introduce a small note of caution. While the current account of the balance of payments is doing well, unfortunately, the financial account is under stress. And this is the financing part of the balance of payments. Our foreign investment is down by almost 35%. The inflow of foreign assistance is somewhat lower, although it was beefed up by the recent flotation of $2.5 billion of euro bonds successfully. But overall, the financial account of the balance of payments up to April, I'm sorry, up to now, we have fortunately last 2 days got the April figures also, is lower. The inflow into the financial account of the balance of payments is lower by $5 billion. So the improvement that we have seen in the current account has been more or less neutralized by the deterioration in the financial account. And as a result of that, our reserves haven't gone up too much. And they have, of course, been beefed up by the $1.4 billion of assistance under the rapid financing facility of the IMF last June, and more recently, injection of about $500 million or so. But our reserves are $15.5 billion or so. But do not forget that behind them, there is $8.5 billion of foreign exchange liabilities of the State Bank of Pakistan. So the net reserve position is not very strong as of now, and we continue to remain somewhat fragile, even though if we look at the aggregate number, we are above 3 months of cover of imports. The other area which I think continues to be, in some sense, the Achilles heel of Pakistan's economy is the large and growing worrying state of public finance. Pakistan's public finances have steadily deteriorated. At the time of the end of the previous government, the fiscal deficit had gone up to 6.6% of the GDP, and it reached a peak the year thereafter to 9%. The previous year, it was 8%, and there's every likelihood that it will be between 7.5% to 8% of the GDP this year. This brings me to a very important point raised by Mr. Iftikhar Raj. and that is the issue of the regional security context today. What with Afghanistan in a very, very fluid situation, and of course, on the other side of our borders, where tense situation remains, and elsewhere there are problems, Palestine and Iran, so on and so forth. The issue is how much economic strength are we providing to our national security? This was an issue which I was not going to examine, but because Iftikhar Raj Saab has raised this very important issue, let me highlight it. During the tenure of the previous government, particularly after Zarb-e-Azb was launched, defense expenditure went up quantitatively, very substantially. And I must give full credit to the honorable and brave soldiers of a country, 10,000 of whom gave their lives. And today Pakistan has faced much less terrorism than it faced about 7 to 8 years ago. But now, in the last 2 years or so, we are seeing a reverse trend. Since 2018-19, the defense budget has stopped growing in real terms. In fact, from 2017-18, when it was 3% of the GDP, this year it will close at below 2.6% of the GDP. And do you know what is the most worrying development? The most worrying development is that in 2018-19, 100% of the defense budget was financed by borrowings. And this year, about half of it is going to be financed by borrowings. This is not sustainable. This kind of a security context is not sustainable. And I remember when at the time when I was in planning and later in finance in the late 90s, we used to ensure that there was a ratio of 3 to 1 between the budgets of India and Pakistan. Today, the ratio is 7.2 to 1. And thank God for the fact that we have the atomic weapon. But nevertheless, the border problems are there. And I think Iftikhar Raj Saab raised a very important issue currently, and we need to focus on that. Let me now come very quickly to the budget-related issues. As it turns out, while the economy is fortunately moving back on the path of hopefully higher and perhaps more resilient growth, the budgetary situation is in no way satisfactory or commendable in terms of progress. This year, the government had budgeted for a deficit of 7% of the GDP. Already in the medium-term budget strategy paper, which they have released, they have said it will be 7.4% of the GDP. And my own recent calculations based on the buildup of government debt up to March, my expectation is that they will cross again close to 8% of the GDP. These are very large deficits. And in terms of the primary deficit, they are close to 2 to 2.5% of the GDP. This is what determines the rate of increase in your public debt or government debt to GDP ratio, which is going to approach 80% of the GDP this year, when you should remember that according to the Fiscal Responsibility and Debt Limitation Act of 2005, the ceiling placed by our parliament was 60%, and we have been consistently over the last 8-9 years crossing that figure. So this is a very worrying state of affairs, and one of the reasons for that, as highlighted by Madam Khurshid, the fundamental problem arises in the low tax to GDP ratio. Over the period of 5 years during the tenure of the previous government, we did see a significant jump of almost 3 percentage points of the GDP in the tax to GDP ratio. And in 5 years' time, tax revenues of FBR doubled. This was no mean achievement. But since then, they have remained flat. So after we reached a peak of 13% of the GDP, this year they are likely to be at 11.5% of the GDP. And that too, particularly because of the bonanza of revenues from the petroleum levy of over 400 billion, which we did not have in earlier years. So that is one problem. The other problem is, thanks with all due respects to a somewhat inappropriate policy by the central bank in 2018-19, when they started raising the policy rate and it reached a peak of 13.25%. And what is amazing is the somewhat amazing debt management policy followed soon afterwards. Do you know that 130% of the increase in the domestic debt from 2017-18 to 2020, 130% of the increase was in long-term PIB debt. Totally contrary to the sensible debt management policy that when your interest rates are very high, you tend to borrow short and avoid getting locked into long-term high-cost debt. And this is what has happened to Pakistan. That policy of raising the interest rates to a peak and then borrowing long-term has led to a situation where each year our debt servicing liability for the next many years will be higher by 600 to 700 billion rupees. This is truly unfortunate policy which was followed. Fortunately, now the interest rates are down to 7%. And I don't know what the committee has announced today, and we'll get to know in the next few hours or so. Today, your debt to GDP ratio close to 80, your debt servicing to GDP ratio close to 6.5%. So already when you take out from the federal revenues, the transfers to the provinces, we have already seen 1 year, 2018-19, when the federal government could not even cover its debt servicing liabilities through its own revenues. Fortunately, the situation has improved somewhat. But this year, we will probably end up covering about half our defense expenditure. The rest, costs of civil administration, subsidies, grants, development spending, everything else, all financed through borrowings. This is not a sustainable state of affairs. And it's very interesting that the 6th review agenda, reform agenda with the IMF agreed in March and reflected in the budget strategy paper approved by the cabinet in April. Clearly now, unambiguously, the focus is not on the balance of payments as much as it is on the public finances of Pakistan. And the reason for that clearly is the fact that eventually, in macroeconomic terms, if you run very large public finance deficits or budget deficits, they inevitably spill over into more demand for imports and thereof contribute to, again, destabilization of the current account deficit. So that is what the IMF is telling us to guard against. So what are the targets in this year's budget? Madam Khurshid has already mentioned some of them. But let us just look at the targets in some detail. Growth in federal revenues, total 25% next year, from about 6,400 billion to 8,000 billion. I mean, we have never seen this kind of phenomenal growth. I pray to God, Allah से दुआ है कि एक साल ऐसा हमें मिल जाए जबकि ये 1600 अरब का इजाफा हो. Within that, The increase in the revenues from FBR is roughly from about 4,700 billion, which may be slightly optimistic, but let's assume that 4,700 billion to about 6,000 billion. That is an increase of 1,300 billion rupees, an increase close to 27%. The highest growth rate we saw was in the 5 years of the previous government, when it approached 21% in 1 year, but we have never managed anywhere close to the 20s in other years. So this is an extraordinarily tough target, which we have agreed to initially, and based on that, got ourselves a release of $500 million. And they, of course, our new macho finance minister is saying that he doesn't want to adhere to those. I don't know what kind of flexibility there exists, but let us not contemplate on that and see what eventually the government does in the budget. But the budget strategy paper approved by the cabinet as it stands today clearly says that we have to have a 27% growth in FBR revenues. On the expenditure side, what is really extraordinary again is that the growth in federal expenditure is to be limited to below 10%. And this is even allowing for a hefty salary increase and the likelihood of some enhancement in pensions. Costing, according to the budget strategy paper, they have maintained and provided for a provision of rupees 260 billion, largely to cover this award. So even after this 260 billion built into the budget for next year, we are expected to restrain spending to a growth rate of less than 10%. And on top of that, the medium-term strategy says that next year we must raise the development spending by 21%. So at the end of the day, current expenditure, excluding everything else, has to grow by less than 7% after provisions have been made for the salary award. Well, this kind of discipline, if it is demonstrated by the government, would be totally and readily welcomed by all of us. This kind of economy in expenditures we have not seen in recent years. Overall, the anticipation is that given the current projection of 7.4% of the GDP, the expectation is that next year it will be brought down to 6% of the GDP. This steep adjustment agreed with the IMF, we have not seen before any time in our history. Hopefully, as I said, it can happen once for the first time. Finally, let me talk a little bit about the revenue agenda. You know, it's very interesting. For the first time in targets, what I see is that the growth rate that is being targeted in indirect taxes for next year, according to these staff report of the IMF following the 5th review completion, it is truly amazing that of the 27% growth targeted in FBR revenues, the highest growth rate is from sales tax, indirect tax, 33%. As opposed to that, income tax is supposed to show somewhat more modest growth of about 24%. And overall, the growth in indirect taxes will be 29%. So suddenly Pakistan, contrary to what our macho new finance minister is saying, the emphasis is on indirect taxes. And what worries me is when you look at the various schedules which we are supposed to withdraw exemptions or withdraw the reduced rates, what are the candidates for this kind of a change in sales tax policy? Number one, fertilizer. 2% sales tax. Is it going to be raised? Our LNG, 12%. Is it going to be brought up to 17%? Cotton import exempt from sales tax. Does the IMF want us to raise it back to 17%? Of course, exports get zero rated, but domestic use of imported cotton would, of course, be fully paying the sales tax. And there are various other products, and you'll be amazed that as a result of the recent policy of protecting the consumer prices of petroleum products, not only has the petroleum levy been slashed from 30 to about 10 to 12 rupees per liter, simultaneously in some products, we have brought the sales tax rate down below 17%. For example, in light diesel oil and kerosene. So the fund is going to ask for all this. You have agreed to all this. You have signed on to this. You've got cabinet approval in the budget strategy paper. What is your flexibility? The fund has already indicated that they're not going to talk to you until the 6th review is to be undertaken in July. So this is the agenda which exists today. On the income tax side, already an ordinance has been brought in and it's been renewed, I think perhaps yesterday or today. And that includes a whole host of measures. And my own problem is that this was not the right time to withdraw fiscal incentives for investment. Just at the time when you are trying to boost investment in the economy. And mind you, investment has not grown phenomenally this year. First indicator is the import of machinery, up only by 2.5%. So it's nothing sensational. So the withdrawal of fiscal incentives like the depreciation allowances and the tax credit for BMR and so on and so forth are ill-advised, I think, and should have been retained. Overall, 27% growth in FDR revenues, 7 to 8% growth in current expenditure. If achieved, we should award a Pakka gold medal to our government, which is certainly making all its efforts to move ahead. So thank you on this note, and I hope next year will turn out, inshallah, to a good year in our economic history. Thank you.
Khurshid, your audio is missing.
Hello, can you hear me?
No, now we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, so there's good news. Dr. Saab is endorsing the 4% economic growth rate of this year and a small current account surplus. He's given us his candid views on the defense budget. And work definitely needs to be done on the tax collection. And it seems that we have gone down in the tax collection ratio since the preceding years of 13%. On the next year's budget, Dr. Saab has flagged his views that the growth revenue is very ambitious at 8,000 billion rupees, and the expenditure is to be capped at 10%, and which is a matter of concern because there are some increases as well in the salaries and the pensions, etc. So one has to see all these things. Sales tax is also a matter of concern because there's a huge increase in the collections by 33%. And I would say that we were hoping that this year there would be some sales tax reduction because we believe that Pakistan has one of the highest sales tax collection ratios. The fiscal investment in incentives also, unfortunately, are not going to be renewed under the BMR. So that's not good news because companies would now not be investing or being very cautious in their investment of capital expenditure. Thank you so much, Dr. Saab, for your views and thoughts. And now I would like to introduce Mr. Ashfaq Tola, our very popular Vice President, who will share with us his views, and then we will take some question and answers as well. Ashfaq is a fellow member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants and also of the Cost and Management Accountant and a council member since 2017. He's currently leading the Fiscal Law Committee as well as the Economic Advisory Committee. And I'm pleased to inform you that this year, for the first time under Ashfaq's leadership, the Economic Advisory Committee has come up with a model budget and presented it to some of the government officials about the views of ICAP and some of the recommendations. So over to you, Ashfaq.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thank you, Khurshid. My worthy president, Mr. Iftikhar Taj, and my mentor and living legend, Dr. Hafeez Pasha Saab, Vice President Ali Latif Saab, Khurshid, and the entire team who is working day and night to make this event a success.
Can I stop my video?
Speaking after Dr. Pasha is really a difficult and a Herculean task. Dr. Pasha's insight on Pakistan economy is second to none. And he is the one who led Pakistan's economy from the front for so many years. And still I can say with certainty and unambiguously that he is the best economist of Pakistan, and he is still knowing the policy and formulating the policy much, much, much better than many other economists of the country. It is because of the fact that Mr. Pasha has spent his life throughout in Pakistan, and he has insight and practical exposure of doing business and framing policies in Pakistan and implementing them. Well, his views are very candid and we all have heard it. But in fact, in my humble view, Pakistan is really at the critical juncture from the economic perspective. I can understand, I mean, being a frontline manager for last 4 or 5 years in this economic scenario, I have learned a lot from Dr. Saab, and which includes, as I mentioned you earlier, sizing the economy of Sindh and then framing the policy of taxation for Sindh Revenue Board. I have learned a lot. As far as Pakistan economy is concerned and the tax revenues are concerned, I think it is my famous quote that let's decide for once and for all that whether the tax will drive the economy of Pakistan or economy will drive the taxation system of Pakistan. So this is something which we need to address right now, and we are at a critical juncture, and we have to just look at it. As far as the recipe of Pakistan's economy is concerned, with a huge parallel base of economy, I think we have to understand one thing, that this recipe of IMF of imposing more and more taxes and clipping the wings of many concessions will cost us dearly. Not now, but maybe in the future. As far as the stability is concerned, and as Dr. Pasha has said, last year we have worked out some economic growth, and on 8th of April I have released my personal report that the economy is shrunk by 0.38%, which was taken very seriously by the then finance team at the federation level. And then I was told that this is a completely wrong picture which I am portraying. Nonetheless, on May 18, if I recall correctly, the federal government through Pakistan National Accounts Committee under Pakistan Bureau of Statistics released the figure, and incidentally, I would say rather, it was 0.38% minus. This year again, we worked out some number, but we never released it because of the fact that we don't want to make it controversial. Our calculations are very simple, but I'm just quoting you that instead of 0.47%, which government has shown the negative balance of last year as a revised estimate, in my humble view, it is 2% minus. The economy shrunk by 2% in last year. And considering that, in my humble view, if at all we have grown by 3.5%. The estimates which we have prepared, I think there are certain figures which we need to recalculate. I mean, not me, the federal government, and maybe next year in the revision we'll got those figures corrected. In the first instance, I think the figure of a small manufacturing is, I think, a bit exaggerated, and it needs a recalculation and attention from the economic manager. Then again, the wheat production, which we came to know on the very last day that Punjab has attained this much of the wheat production, I think it again requires an attention from the economic manager. When it comes to construction side, yes, we have got a good amount of construction going on. But again, my fears are that on supply side, we are okay. But as far as demand is concerned, we will not be in a position to have that much demand. Well, again, coming back to non-commodity portion or construction or maybe slaughtering portion, we have wholesale and retail, which has grown by more than 8%. Again, it is having a big question mark, and in my humble view, it again need a recalculation. So by and large, in my humble view, the growth is around 2.9 to 3.1%. And if we take 0.7% as last year negative, I think it is around 2.5%, not more than that. We have to extrapolate that. Pasha Sahab is rightly said कि जी कि पाकिस्तान की इकोनॉमी ये इतना आसान काम नहीं है इसको प्रेडिक्ट करना, बिकॉज ऑफ द फैक्ट कि बहुत सारे इकोनॉमिस्ट हमारे जो कमेंट्स कर रहे होते हैं उनकी इंसाइट ही नहीं होती कि कैलकुलेशन मेथड्स क्या है। एंड मैं ये समझता हूँ जिन्होंने ये प्रैक्टिकली काम किया है सिटिंग बैक एट फाइनेंस डिवीजन या स्टैटिस्टिक्स डिवीजन में, और जो प्रैक्टिकली काम कर चुके हैं उनको पता है कि ये एक्चुअल कैलकुलेशन कैसे होती है। While there are so many other vectors to it, but I'm not going into detail because Pasha Sahab has explained everything in detail. When this target of 6 trillion या 6,000 अरब का it was set while review of IMF, मैंने उसी वक्त मीडिया पे ये बात कही थी on 8th of February शादेब खानजादा साहब के प्रोग्राम में कि आई थिंक दिस इज नेक्स्ट टू इम्पॉसिबल। मैंने ये वर्ड यूज किए थे कि ये शायद ख्वाब है जो शर्मिंदा होगा, इसकी ताबीर नहीं। एंड वी कैन सी कि विद इन अ स्पैन ऑफ 3 months ये 200 बिलियन से अब हमारी इकोनॉमिक टीम कह रही है 5800 बिलियन पे। अगर मैं 5800 बिलियन भी टारगेट को ले लेता हूँ और अगर मैं लेके चलूँ उसको, तो दैट मीन्स इफ पाशा साहब एंड माय एस्टिमेट्स ऑफ करंट ईयर्स ऑप्टिमिस्टिक achievement of revenue targets of 4,007 trillion is okay, we need to collect 5,000, which is 1,100 billion, 1.1 trillion, which will be 2.3% of the GDP. In good years of progress and growth, where we attain the growth of 5% plus, हमारा जो text to GDP का जो फर्क आता था वो 1% आता था। तो 2.3 इस इकोनॉमी में जहां पर आप ट्राई कर रहे हैं कि इसको आप एक्यूमुलेशन की तरफ लेके जाएं, इज नेक्स्ट टू इम्पॉसिबल। दूसरा ये है कि अगर आप करेंगे और विल बी डुएलिंग द सेम ओल्ड काउज और मिल्किंग द ओल्ड काउज, मेरा ख्याल है उनकी इकोनॉमी जो होगी वो डेड वेट लॉस की तरफ जाएगी। एंड इन माय हम्बल व्यू ये अचीवेबल नहीं होगा अगर मैं 4700 अरब दूं। एंड एज पाशा साहब हैज सेड दैट we are looking at an economic growth of GDP growth of 5.2% and an inflation target of 8%. तो अगर मैं लेता भी हूँ तो ये बनता है मेरा 13.2%, which translate if we can take this as a base figure 4,700 to 5,320. 350 बिलियन के हम कहते हैं टैक्सेस नहीं लगाएंगे, जिसमें पाशा साहब ने एक्सप्लेन किया as we have agreed, and you can find on page 61 of IMF review report that we will do away with the concessions of sales tax worth 326 billion, which will translate into inflation, and मेरा ख्याल है again this is not advisable. इसके अलावा भी अगर मैं इसको ऐड कर देता हूँ तो there is a gap of 130 billion. मेरा ख्याल है again going for administrative measure and achieving these targets are next to impossible. Up wishful thinking has no end. We are targeting over 2,000 billion worth of non-tax revenue. Yes, State Bank के profit काफी हैं और मेरा ख्याल है 2 सालों में हमने जो 1800 अरब के नोट छापे हैं उसकी वजह से 3 या 3.5% की इन्फ्लेशन हो गई। 13.25 जब हमने इंटरेस्ट रेट या पॉलिसी रेट किया उसकी वजह से, जैसे पाशा साहब ने कहा, वी हैव ज्योमेट्रिकली प्रोग्रेशन में हमने अपना डेट सर्विसिंग कर दी है। अब हम 7% पे जब लाएं तो मेरा ख्याल है वी नीड अगेन अ कट, और पॉलिसी कल आ जाएगी तो इन माय ओपिनियन इसको हमें 4% पे लाना चाहिए। बट आई डोंट थिंक विद द करंट थिंग मेरा ख्याल है ये रिड्यूस करेंगे। The recipe of Pakistan economy, as time and again I am saying, is that low interest rate due to huge parallel economy, क्योंकि इन्वेस्टमेंट अपॉर्चुनिटी आपके पास जब ऑल्टरनेट होती है तो आप इन्वेस्टमेंट मेन स्ट्रीम इकोनॉमी में नहीं करते। और दूसरा आपका मैनेज पैरिटी आपको करनी पड़ेगी एंड यू हैव टू हैव स्ट्रॉन्ग एक्सचेंज रेगुलेशन। तो मैं ये समझता हूँ ये 2 चीजें हैं जिसको हमें परस्यू करना पड़ेगा। और मेरा ख्याल है IMF से वी हैव टू रीनेगोशिएट। आई डोंट नो वेदर इट इज पॉसिबल और नॉट, but these are a few things which we have to bear in mind. Coming back to ICAP's budget, yes, Khurshid is right. Khurshid, we have taken this lead again, and I know this is because of the fact that we have got a very good team, and under the patronage of my worthy president, Mr. Sakhar Taj, who has given me a free hand to go for it, and Ali Latif, who has always given me a very good piece of advices. और आप लोगों की सबकी मेहनत थी, मैं तो सिर्फ उसको कंपाइल कर रहा था। ऑब्वियसली माय सेक्रेटेरिएट अमरीन ने बहुत काम किया, उमर जमाल ने बहुत काम किया। तो इन माय हम्बल व्यू एक टीम वर्क था। एंड माय टीम स्पेशली खुर्शीद ने बहुत काम किया, सायरा ने बहुत काम किया, समीउल्लाह तारिक ने बहुत काम किए। तो मैं समझता हूँ इन लोगों के काफी कंट्रीब्यूशन है। एंड डॉक्टर साहब, आई हैव सेंट यू अ कॉपी, एन ई कॉपी ऑफ इट, और आपको मैं एक हार्ड कॉपी भी भेज दूंगा। We have estimated 6,000 trillion, और हमारे जो एस्टिमेट है मेरा ख्याल है अच्छे भी हैं। Tomorrow inshallah we are giving a presentation to Council of Economic Journalists, Economic and Energy Journalists, और उनके क्वेश्चन आंसर्स भी हमें निपटाने हैं। डॉक्टर साहब के भी काफी क्वेश्चन हैं इस पे। And our projection says that we will end up in, if we achieve a target of 6 trillion, will end up in budget deficit of 7.52% of GDP. दूसरी तरफ हमने sensitivity analysis भी की है, और उसके तहत अगर if we achieve 5,750 trillion और maybe 5,500 trillion, मेरा ख्याल है हमारी जो deficit है, fiscal deficit, it will go as high as 7.94%. और मेरा ख्याल है जब expenditure बढ़ते हैं तो डॉक्टर साहब ने सही कहा, it goes high and high. So with these words again, I'll just focus on the questions we have received from our worthy viewers and my team of my panelists. And Dr. Saab, आपके लिए कुछ questions हैं, और please guide us and give your insight to it. The first question we have received that about the exports, that since last so many years, based on the commodity prices, we are having our stagnant export of goods. Do you think we need a change in policy in order to boost the exports? Ali Latif साहब, अपना mic mute कर देंगे please. Ali Latif साहब, अपना mic mute कर दें please. Dr. Saab, over to you with this question.
A very good question, and let me say that one of the greatest disappointments for in the neoclassical school of economics, to which IMF totally belongs to, the quantum depreciation of the rupee, which we brought down from about 104 rupees at one stage. It fell down to 168 rupees at the peak of the COVID attack last year. Now, fortunately, it has come down significantly by about 13, 14 rupees. Yet exports did not show growth. So this theory that exchange rate can work, it did not work. And my own view is that what we need are structural reforms of a very different kind in order to build our exports. The first thing is that our exporters have generally enjoyed some kinds of incentives, but they are not being operating in a proper and in a desirable fashion. Perhaps the best example of this is the fact that in the budget of 2019-20, we withdrew the zero rating provision on domestic sales. This was a big move, and in a sense, partly neutralized any incentive that may have been provided by the exchange rate depreciation. The other problem, which has been a chronic problem, has this whole process of management of sales tax refunds. My own view is that let's move away from this discretionary process of payment of refunds. I would suggest we follow the Bangladesh example, or even to partially the scrip duty example of India, and determine in advance, based on input-output coefficients, what are the sales tax effective rates on different exports, and release these along with the export receipts automatically. Get out of this refund, if I may use the word, market. The other thing is that we have to now also focus on diversification. 56% for exports are textiles. And the good news is that this year we are seeing an improvement in terms of the value-added component of textiles. I mean, our bedwear exports and knitwear exports have done well. The value of ready-made garment sales has gone up, export sales, although the quantity has been somewhat reduced, according to the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics. We have 8 to 10 products which are in the range of $200 to $400 million of exports. And some of them are interesting new exports, like I'll give you one example, meat preparations. I mean, Pakistan being an Islamic country, how is it that India exports 12 times as much as we do of halal meat? There are so many nascent and emerging exports. We need to study each one of them, see what are the constraints to the development. And for God's sake, I've served also as the Commerce Minister, and I remember at that time we used to have what was called the Export Promotion Bureau, which was later called the Trade and Development Authority. Unfortunately, has not done strategic work on what are the critical inputs for facilitating particularly emerging exports. We need to build that in. So my own view is that if we were to improve the liquidity position of exports, and for God's sake, do not raise electricity tariffs. Even this increase to $9 of per kilowatt hour on exports is a very counter move. Interestingly, one of my PhD students has done some very interesting work on pricing of electricity. And that is that she, in fact, it's a lady, she has in fact concluded that actually Pakistan would do better if we were to bring down tariffs generally. And that because what would happen is that in the presence of about 15 to 16% excess capacity, particularly now with the recent commissioning, the Chinese plants and so on, Pakistan must use this excess capacity. And one of the simplest lessons of ordinary economics is when you have excess capacity, reduce prices to use your product more. The interesting thing is that if you reduce the prices and you get a fillip to exports and industrial production, the gain in revenues, value-added tax, income tax, and so on, is 3 times the revenue that you lose from reducing tariffs. I hope to God someday somebody will begin to realize this. A country which is endowed now with excess capacity after having lived for many years in the world of high load shedding should now fully take advantage of this excess capacity. I would be very happy if we could bring down our export tariffs on electricity down to about $7 or so, more or less comparable to what we see in the rates are much higher elsewhere. So my own feeling is maybe I've used the wrong measure. What I meant was that we should bring down the price of electricity down for industry, boost industrial production, and we will get 3 times as much revenue. I'm working on finalizing this piece of research. Overall, exports, structural focus, facilitation of liquidity, moving towards diversification, identification of constraints to individual export items, and finally, pricing down the electricity tariff.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. Dr. Saab, if you recall, we held a joint study on export rebates as well when conducting a study on single state sales tax. And when I worked out some numbers, and obviously through your brilliance and intellect, we worked out some numbers, and based on that, अगर हम sales tax को हटा दें, तो हमें 85 billion का refund देना पड़ रहा था along with remittances जो आपने अभी जिक्र किया, and which is one of the brilliant form of boosting the export and curbing these sales tax frauds. And we have given it to IMF as well, we have given it to the federal government as well, but 5 साल में मेरा ख्याल है उस पे आज तक कोई action नहीं हुआ. So, I mean, we have reworked the numbers now again, and for your consumption and knowledge, these numbers are now 196 billion rupees. और still, अगर हम दे देते हैं तो मेरा ख्याल है ये refund माफिया का काफी आपका जो सारे exports हमने ले लिए. What is your take on this? That we are merely paying these rebates and refunds to eventual exporters, but we are not trickling it down to downstream industry, suppose to the ginner, to the cotton grower, to the spinning sector. Those whosoever is making the final export are getting benefit of it. So don't you think they are also entitled to have some relief? Because those who are exporters, they are getting a big bonanza, whereas the pricing therein is not built accordingly. So
yeah, I agree with you that you see, the key thing is to understand the supply chain and to focus on the critical components of that supply chain. My own feeling is that Bangladesh has a very interesting policy. It works its way through the value chain. And in fact, I think one of the reasons why Bangladesh did better, needless to say, with low wages and so on and so forth, was this ingenious way of managing. And Pakistan is an interesting country. There was a time in Pakistan's history when we were considered as one of the most ingenious exporting countries in the world, with a remarkably sophisticated scheme called the bonus voucher scheme in the 60s. This was a market which gave you a higher exchange rate and kept the price of machinery low because that was at low exchange rate, whereas the exports were at the exchange rate, including the bonus voucher. And that was skillful management. And it's not surprising that Pakistan's exports of textiles started taking off at that time. What you need is ingenuity and really structural measures to boost exports. What I must say is that our small scale manufacturing industry, the extraordinary expertise and talent of our workers has never been fully harnessed. And I couldn't agree more with your point that to the extent that there is a forward value chain and a forward link from small to big, the small part should also be a beneficiary in this process.
Dr. Saab, the next question which we have from our audience is that the salaried person in small businesses are also subject to higher income tax rates. और जो हमने agree किया है अभी IMF से कि we will slash down those high levels to only 5 brackets. और दूसरा आपको पता है कि जी normal आपका जो provincial sales tax भी है. So this is causing great distress to the businesses, small businesses and salaried people. What do you think? कि जो आपका tax breaks जहां पर आते हैं, can we have minimum asset tax as we discussed so many times to just create some balances and earn more or maybe getting more revenues out of it?
Okay, now on this income tax, personal income tax system and scheme. Yes, most countries in our region particularly do have a limited number of slabs, 5 to 6. Pakistan is unusual in having as many as 11 slabs. And the end result is that we have a situation where by the time we get to the maximum rate, which is 35%, we are in the range of 75 million rupees per annum, and then probably there's few people only in this country who would be earning that kind of money. What we need to do, particularly in light of the inflation that we have seen in the last 2 years, is, yes, move to 6 slabs, but raise the exemption limit, which hasn't been raised for some time now, from 600,000 rupees to at least 900,000 rupees. And then you start from your slab of 5% and move in slabs which are about 2 to 2.5 million each, and probably attain the maximum rate, which should not be 35, it should be 30, because it should be comparable to the corporate income tax rate, and thereby ensure that people who are earning, say, less than 100 to 150,000 rupees a month in the salaried group actually do get some break in the tax liability. And the tax liability, however, does go up somewhat for those who are in the very high income bracket. That's my recommendation.
Thank you, Arvind. Dr. साहब, एक और बड़ा interesting question है जो मैं कर रहा हूँ आपसे कि we have got a minimum turnover tax of 1.5% and maybe quite a few low slabs for specialized companies. और आपका जो corporate rate है वो 29% है. And you know कि 80% of my large companies, those who are contributing almost 90% of income tax, they are paying turnover tax. Then what is the use of having such high rate? Give them at least psychological benefit and reduce it to maybe 20 or 25%. And because once they have to pay a minimum tax, they will be paying. Secondly, we have analyzed when we were working on under your able guidance on single state sales tax. If you recall, only 25 top taxpayers were contributing 90% of sales tax, whereas 25 से आप हटाते हैं और 1,15,000 पे जब ले आते हैं टोटल टैक्स सेल्स टैक्स फाइलर के, वहां पर हमारा इफेक्टिव रेट 11 से नीचे आके 3.78 पे आ रहा है. So that is causing frauds and illegal refunds. So what is your take on it? Shall we reduce the sales tax rate and bring it to a single digit and just flip down the अपना आपके जो requirements हैं? दूसरा, आपका जो टर्नओवर टैक्स है वो इतना ज्यादा है कि या तो उसको आप कम करें, या तो आपका कॉर्पोरेट रेट है जो 29% है उसको मैं लेके आऊं और उसको मैं लेके जाऊं 20% पे टू गिव अ बेटर फीलिंग टू द इन्वेस्टर्स. व्हाट इज योर टेक?
Very important questions. And on the corporate income tax front, you see, Pakistan today has a somewhat higher corporate income tax than countries around us. This is a fact. And although India cleverly fudges it by having 1 or 2 cesses imposed on top of the normal corporate tax liabilities. My own view is that, first of all, I don't like minimum taxes as a principle. They violate the principle of equity. A firm or a company which is losing money is being asked to pay tax on turnover only expedites its demise. This is not acceptable. This is not in line with the correct principles of taxation. What I would suggest, and some countries have done this, in fact, India also has done this, have a progressive corporate income tax linked to the return on equity. If the return on equty is, say, below 15%, then your rate could be, say, initially 25, then brought down to 20. And any return above the 15% return on equity, you may charge an additional 5% or maybe 7.5% or whatever it is. But try and make the progressivity also the concept in corporate income taxation as we do in personal income tax. And for God's sake, get rid of this minimum tax on turnover. This was done by the previous government in a hurry to get additional revenues. It was 0.5%, and eventually became now 1.5%. It has to be reduced and eliminated as soon as possible. On this issue, on the single state sales tax, yes, it will be much easier to administer, there's no doubt. But you see, the problem with this single state sales tax is that it leads to what's known as cascading. If there is a value chain which is long, like you see at the fag end of textiles, there are at least maybe even a dozen links in that chain. And if you have a single state sales tax of say 5% or so, it gets cumulatively, it rises at every stage because you add 5% on the 5% on the 5% and 5% and so on. So it can lead to a stage where more value added industry or more value added chains actually end up paying, at the end of the day, a higher tax. I'm still in favor of the value added tax. However, what I would like to see with all this chaos with respect to taxation of services, to move towards eventually what India has done. Merge the value added tax and simplify it to the extent possible for the lower end of the production size, and somehow or the other merge the two, goods and services, and bring down the overall sales tax rate, at least initially from 17 to 15. You will still get more revenues because the documentation and the access to input information would be phenomenally much greater, and this would help us in collecting much more. I believe that the IMF and the World Bank are trying to help in us moving in this direction. This to me would be an appropriate direction. It would lead to a much more neutral value-added tax across sectors of the economy and certainly help us in augmenting our revenues from services.
Thank you, Dr. Saab, for detailed insight. ये एक क्वेश्चन मेरे पास आया है, बड़ा अच्छा क्वेश्चन है, Sayyid Imtiaz Abbas Hussain. So this question is that in your recent interview, you have said that 1 rupee of spending in PSDP increased 2 rupees in GDP. Obviously, you have given these advices to the previous governments as well. Is there any reason for not implementing that by the previous government, and why this government is also not heeding any attention to it?
You see, the problem is, as I said, the Achilles heel of this economy today are your public finances. And within that, of course, we start with a very high debt ratio, servicing ratio, and a very low tax to GDP ratio. The problem is, look what has happened to your development spending. And when the previous government left, development spending was on the right side of 4% of the GDP, when you combine both the provincial and the federal government, the PSDPs or ADPs. Today, it is down to 2.6% of the GDP. I mean, this is shocking. In our time, in the late 90s, we remember we used to target for 6 to 7% of the GDP. And you have, Tola Saab, an unbelievable situation. We are carrying a portfolio of 1,023 ongoing projects. 1,023. And your throw forward in the federal government's PSDP of projects, that is the cost that is yet to be incurred on ongoing projects, is 8 trillion rupees. And your budget annually is maximum this year is 600 possibly. It will take us anyway something like perhaps 13 years to implement a typical project. And by that time, the cost overrun would be a factor of about 3. Hopelessly mismanaged. I'm using strong language, but I'm compelled to do so. We have mismanaged the development planning as well as the implementation process of projects. We have avoided prioritization. There has been this political handout approach, and the end result is you end up with 1,023 projects to implement. And then finally on this issue of the PSDP, with all due respects, we've had perhaps a bit too much of highways. The time has come to shift decisively to irrigation, hydropower, and better electricity distribution system. I would suggest that almost 40 to 45% of our PSDP at the federal level must go to these 2 sectors. And now that the CPEC highway peak is over, let us for the time being not invest so heavily in highways.
Thank you, Dr. साहब. Dr. साहब, एक सवाल मुझे मरवाने के लिए एक मेंबर ने कर दिया है और मुझे पता है आपसे बड़ी मुझे झाड़ पड़ेगी, तो मैं सुन लूंगा. आप उस्ताद हैं मेरे. What are the likely chances? हमारे मुस्तफा लखानी साहब हैं, वो कहते हैं what are the likely chances of government considering and adopting ICAP's budget or proposals which we have sent to the government?
I think you see, the important thing is I've had a look at some of those proposals, and particularly the direct taxation front. You see, I mean, after all, the kind of expertise that our accountancy profession possesses, and I have a lot of respect for that. And when I used to sit in the council on the tax front, I remember we had you, for example, and you gave us some outstanding suggestions. We have to begin to respect the views of our professionals. And I personally, for example, you know, I'm so glad that Madam Khurshid also mentioned this, that giving up on fiscal incentives to investment at this time borders on, unfortunately, a suicidal policy. This is a time when the market environment is beginning to improve. All said and done, there is this perception, and you see it now reflected in the turnover, for example, in the stock market and so on. Is this the time when you want to stop firms from investing in expansion, in modernization, replacement, or even in new investment? And I would go to the extent of giving very liberal incentives for investment in the SEZs, particularly if they are linked to the extent to which a particular unit is engaged in exports. I mean, virtually eliminate all component of taxes on machinery, on materials, and on income.
Question is from one of our senior members, Sohail Usman Ali Saab. वो यही कहते हैं कि जी के throughout the world, people are contributing towards taxation liabilities, but in Pakistan, we are not getting any return while we retire. So do you think this problem of not paying taxes or maybe avoiding taxes or maybe evading taxes on account of personal taxation is just because of the fact that people are not getting appropriate benefit from the government side when they retire? What is
well,
your take?
you know, the point is conceptually a very valid one. You see, unless there is a perception of a link between taxes paid and benefits received, generally the willingness to pay taxes tends to diminish. We did a survey of 1,000 taxpayers 2-3 years ago. And do you know what was their primary reason and for not being satisfied with the tax system? The number one reason was that they felt that paying the taxes, there was no link at whatsoever with any benefits that they received, including, of course, in the case of retired persons, a better pension policy. So this is clearly a problem. And that is the reason why, for example, we were very keen that the property tax system should be localized to the extent possible. Because the property tax is the classic case of a tax which is linked to benefits received at the community or neighborhood level. Unfortunately, devolution of the tax system has not taken place to the extent it might have. So I agree with the observation made that to the extent possible, there should at least be a perception of a link between taxes paid and benefits received.
Good reply, sir. Sir, there are quite a few members. They have given some suggestions to it. One of them is Mr. Hassan Raza, and he's saying that if we will not improve tax to GDP ratio, we'll end up in a mess. And already we have got 80+% of public debt to GDP ratio. What is your take on this? Okay, future में हम किस तरह, because के राजा साहब मैं थोड़ा सा जवाब देता हूँ उस पे. We have worked out some number. इसमें हमने ये कहा था कि एक जीरो बेस बजटिंग का हमारा कॉन्सेप्ट था कि ये डॉक्टर साहब इस पे इंडोर्स करेंगे. If we go for that, so instead of 6 trillion, we have to collect 15 trillion. तो 15 ट्रिलियन अगर मैं करता हूं, मेरी टैक्स टू जीडीपी 37% आती है, तो मैं अवॉइड कर सकता हूं अपने डेट को, फ्यूचर डेट, और डेट सर्विसिंग हम कर सकते हैं. बिलो दैट वी कैन नॉट. सो इट इज अनडिजायरेबल. सो इंस्टेड ऑफ दैट द न्यूमरेटर, डिनोमिनेटर को हमें बढ़ाना चाहिए जीडीपी को. और जीडीपी को ग्रोथ के लिए, जैसे पाशा साहब ने भी अभी कहा कि हमारे पास पब्लिक स्पेंडिंग होनी चाहिए, हमारा इन्फ्लेशन शुरू में कंट्रोल में आप रखें, नोट प्रिंटिंग्स को कम से कम रखें और आप सेविंग हैबिट्स को बढ़ाएं. तो दिस इज द ओनली रेसिपी. इंटरेस्ट रेट लो होने चाहिए, आपका पैरिटी मैनेज होनी चाहिए, इन्फ्लेशन अंडर कंट्रोल हो, और आप इसको इंसेंटिवाइज करें, पीएसडीपी गवर्नमेंट करे, और उधर से आपकी जीडीपी बढ़ेगी. जीडीपी बढ़ती है तो डेट का फिगर जो भी आता है वो आपकी परसेंटेज टर्म में कम होता है. So instead of looking at the numbers, we have to see the percentage. Raza Sahab, ye mere Pasha Sahab, would you like to add something to it?
I just wanted to add, you know, where is the fiscal space, if I can use that expression, for mobilizing somewhat more revenue? You know, when you look at the sectoral contributions, you will be amazed that almost 70% of the revenue comes from industry. About 24 to 26% comes from services because of banking, insurance, and so on. And only 4% comes from agriculture. We have something called the agricultural income tax in Pakistan, which is, according to the constitution, it lies with the provincial governments. The fiscal powers are with the provincial governments. I'll just give you one or two numbers on the reality with respect to the agricultural income tax. Today, based on the agricultural census of 2010, 1% of the biggest farmers, the landlords, own 22% of the farm area in the country. 1% own 22%. Their net income, net of all payments, including payments to workers within their or sharing with tenants and so on and so forth, is 700 billion rupees, very carefully estimated by me and my students. How much revenue are we getting from the agricultural income tax? With a lot of effort, 2.5 billion rupees, 0.3%. I mean, it is this kind of inequity in the tax system and the loss thereof of revenues due to privileges of selected segments. Others I will not mention for the time being. I'm sure some of you know who they are. I've just given you a very, very dramatic, clear example of under-taxation within the law of the country. Not that there is evasion. This is taxation low because of low rates and no effort at collection. So we will have to begin to focus on these areas where there is the ability to pay taxes, but due to the law and the system in existence. I mean, if I may be allowed to say one thing more, perhaps this could mean the end to this event. Why should, with all due respect, with all humility, why should Supreme Court judges be exempt fully from paying tax? Why should corps commanders in the second schedule of the income tax not have to pay taxes on some of their allowances? Can somebody have the courage to ask these questions? At the fag end of my life, I'm doing so.
Sir,
I will give you one small example, and this could be a good, appropriate conclusion. In the late 90s, when I was used to make the budgets behind the scenes because Tatsa was busy doing other things, I put forward in the finance bill one very innocent proposal, which was that why should we not have sales tax charged from cantonment stores? And there was a real hullabaloo on this. Doc Saab, kya hai? Kya kar rahe hain aap? To this day, cantonment stores remain exempt. I have no problem if a special card is given to our soldiers and they have access to exemption. But why should everybody have access to exemption? And that tends to cut into the business of private sector outlets. So there are these little things which today I'm having the courage to mention because I'm at the fag end of my life. But please, for God's sake, these visual manifestations of inequity in the tax system corrode people's willingness and their commitment to paying taxes. So this is very important that we try and introduce more vertical equity into our tax system.
Dr. Saab, to your utter surprise, this is what we have wrote in Tax Reforms Commission report.
Yes, I know
this
that.
This is a
I've
public
seen that.
document, and we have
Yes.
personally, I mean, I authored a few part of it, and this was my portion, that no exemption shall be given to anyone. And just for the record purposes, Dr. Saab, 43% of our GDP, real GDP, is contributing less than even 1% of the tax, direct income tax. And
Services.
No, sir, including wholesale and retail and agriculture.
Yeah, mostly.
And then if we go for exports, nowhere in the world they've given this privilege of 1% tax on their turnover irrespective of their income. So in all, my 51% is not contributing towards my direct income taxes. So ये काफी एक disparity है which we need to evaluate, and obviously we need to compensate them somewhere else, not here in the income tax, and lower the collection. Nonetheless, sir, there are quite a few questions. If you allow me, बहुत अच्छे questions हैं. एक question sir हमारे एक दोस्त की तरफ से है. They are saying that what measures should be taken by government to increase the number of tax filers in Pakistan. देखिए ये मैं आपको बताता हूँ, इसमें हमने काफी कोशिश की थी और अभी भी कर रहे हैं. ICAP की जो टैक्स प्रपोजल्स हैं, इकोनॉमिक प्रपोजल को अगर मैं हटा भी दूं तो उसमें काफी चीजें हमने डाली हैं. और वी वेंट टू दैट एक्सटेंट कि सिंस के ऑटोमेटेड सिस्टम है अगर, तो आपकी 30 to 50% जो आपकी जो फील्ड फोर्स है उनको यू गिव देम दिस टास्क ऑफ ब्रॉडनिंग द टैक्स बेस and engaging and enrolling new numbers. तो वो मेरा ख्याल है अभी नादरा का डेटा भी हवा में ही आ रहा होता है, जा रहा होता है, मगर कभी भी उसका कोई बेनिफिट आज तक हमने नहीं उठाया. तो ये सर हमने किए. ताहिर साहब, एक और मेरे पास क्वेश्चन है. ये अपकमिंग बजट में हमने क्या कहा है कि इन्वेस्टमेंट बूस्ट हो. सर, we have soft copy which is available on ICAP's website, and if you go through page number 18 and 19 of that, I think you will find everything that what we have suggested the government from agriculture के perspectives to manufacturing side. There's so many brilliant examples जिसको हमने कहा है इनको, और we have given them very substantial issues to be considered. तो ये कुछ चीजें थी. डॉक्टर साहब, thank you very much again.
Thank you.
नहीं, अभी सर आपको मेरे जो diligent vice president है अली लतीफ, Khurshid will introduce him, and then that will be the end after his vote of thanks. Thank you very much, Doctor, from my side. Very good insight today, and I have learned a lot as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ashfaq. Thank you, Dr. Saab, and thank you all the audience for the numerous questions. Dr. Saab, we really appreciate your insights and giving us best practices of Bangladesh and India and sharing your views on the export refund model as well as on the benefits that can be given of surplus electricity to the industrial undertakings, as well as the numerous discussions on corporate tax and minimum tax, etc. And of course, not forgetting the PSDP budget and its planning. So now we move on to the last session. And with that, I'd like to welcome Mr. Ali Latif, who will give a thank you note. And let me introduce Mr. Ali Latif to all of you. He is our talented Vice President and Council member since 2017. He has also served as an elected member of the Northern Regional Committee of ICAP for 2 consecutive terms. Mr. Latif is a second-generation chartered accountant. He is the son of a well-known practicing chartered accountant, late Mr. T.K. Rahmani. Over to you, Mr. Ali Latif.
Thank you so much, Khurshid. My dear ICAP members, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. It was indeed a great honor to hear from Honorable Dr. Hafeez Pasha Sahab, who shared his candid views on the Pakistan economy and especially the upcoming budget. And as you already are aware, that due to the role of the only national leader which was bestowed by the government powers under the CA ordinance to regulate the accountancy profession, ICAP has always shared a close relationship with the government of Pakistan, and the institute has been always committed to share its perspective on the taxation policies with the decision makers. And now with the efforts of the Economic and Government Relations Committee headed by Mr. Ashfaq Tola, we were also able to share our perspective on the budget as well, which was highly appreciated by the Finance Minister. This year has witnessed relatively depressed economic activity due to COVID, irrespective of the rosy figures coming in, and the truth probably we'll learn probably a bit later on. But I think the silver lining of after all this the depressive talk Dr. Hafeez Pasha Sahab would allow is, rest assured, these are budgets, these are targets, and we should have been more worried have been meeting those budgets and targets in the last 5 years. So there is still a bit of silver lining, and I think with the more role that ICAP is getting into towards budget and talking about a more responsive and equitable taxation system. But we also, ICAP believes that the taxation system should be revamped with a more simplified procedure. I also believe that you cannot talk about the budgets without having the discussion on its political ramifications as well. We have had a bit of hint about the Bangladesh perspective and other perspectives as well of our neighbor as well. And definitely once we mature to that level that the budget should be discussed with a political angle as well, I think we'll be having a more fruitful discussion and more candid views. And I'm greatly thankful to the honorable speaker and participants for their presence. And on a lighter side, I would say that we were very grateful because we don't have one living legend with us. We have 2. No doubt Dr. Hafeez Sahab and the very own Ashfaq Tola Sahab, who's also a living legend, even though he's quite humble and does not acknowledge it. And thank you so much, Tola Sahab, and thank you so much, Dr. Hafeez Pasha Sahab, and especially you, Mr. Khurshid Kutala. Thank you so much for today's seminar.
Thank you.
A lot has been left unsaid, but I don't worry, we all have learned from that tidbits that you have used. We are all aware of it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Saab, for your views and your time, for taking out and patiently answering all these questions. Thank you, Ashfaq. I think without you, these sessions could not have reached their height of success. So congratulations to you, Ali Latif, Iftikhar Taj Saab, thank you for participating. In the end, I would also like to thank my teammates, Sana Qadri, Tahir Saeed, and Ambreen Barwani for their help and support in managing today's event. Thank you. And Khuda
Thank you,
Hafiz.
sir. Thank you so much.
Hafiz.
And just one thing I would like to tell you, I'm also popular in my own region. It's not only Tola Sahib is popular all around Pakistan, but you introduced him as such. So I just wanted to let you know that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We
Thank
Thank you
you.
still
so very.
interact a lot with you.